Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, TV land. This is WeBeam TV, and welcome to Taboo Talk with Ray and Steve. I'm Ray Amanat in sunny Port Richey, Florida at the WeBeam Studios, and my co-host, Mr. Steve Reed, is in an undisclosed safe house somewhere in northern Texas, trying to figure out how to fix his leg and do leg therapy so he can get back to running, skipping, whatever he likes to do. Steve, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm ready for the jumping jacks and hopping, and so.
Well, we'll start with the low impact jumping jacks, and then you can get into some of the other stuff.
Ray, I got to say thank you right off the bat that I've graduated from being in the outhouse to back into the safe house again.
Well, I was going to say the dog house, but
been there too. Mercy.
Right,
how are you today?
I'm doing excellent. Got a lot on my plate, and I'm excited to get to our guest today. But before we do that, I'd like to let our Taboo Talkers, our viewers, know that all of our episodes have a lot of sponsors that we bring on. And if you would like to be a paid sponsor on our show, you can reach out to us through our Facebook page at Taboo Talk with Ray and Steve. Just check it out. And direct message us to inquire about sponsoring or advertising or promoting your services or products on our show. Our first sponsor is, of course, Heroes in Action, which is a foundation that I've started over 17 years ago. Heroes in Action is a nonprofit organization dedicated to violence prevention education. We do lectures, seminars, and presentations all over the country. Those of you that live in the Port Richey area or are near us, Newport Richey, Hudson, anywhere like that, if you would like to come in for 3 introductory lessons for just $97. You can reach out to me at heroesinaction.us and just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to set up an appointment or a consultation on all the different programs that we offer. So again, Heroes in Action is one of our sponsors, which segues into our topic for today. On today's show, our topic will be overcoming addiction and the effects it has on your personal relationships at home, at work, and with your close friendships. Our guest is Mr. Loren Norris, who is an international leadership speaker, a trainer, and a coach, not to mention a founding partner of the John Maxwell Team. Mr. Norris is also the author of Live a More Excellent Life and 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. So I'd like to go ahead and bring Mr. Norris on. Loren, welcome to Taboo Talk with Ray and Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
As a leadership speaker and educator, can you explain to our viewers what addiction has to do with being a leader or leadership in general?
Some would say that leadership by itself is addictive because the nature of leadership says, I'm all in, I'm fully committed, I will do anything, I will take any risk, I will charge forward, charge the guns, if you will, on the battlefield. I'm going to be a part of what's going on at all costs. Well, an addict has kind of the same philosophy. The addict says, I'm going to get my fix. And it doesn't really matter what that addiction is. For some people, victimization is an addiction. Codependency is a good example of that. Some people have to have drama in their life. I raised 2 girls and 2 boys. And I tell you, one of my 2 daughters, if there wasn't drama going on, she would make some up. We had to have drama. She was kind of addicted to the drama. But when it comes to leadership, the challenge with addiction, with any kind of addiction, is that it becomes all-consuming. And so whether it's the drama or it's bad relationships, you might hear women say, I just love a bad boy. I like the guys that are a little bit of trouble. It's a different kind of addiction. But the challenge with addiction is always that it will cause you to do things that otherwise you would think illogical. And people from the outside often look at those who are addicted and say, how could you do that? And what they're unwilling to acknowledge is that the addiction made me do it. And so we see leaders of all calibers in all industries, whether you're talking about ministry or media, across the board, leaders who've lost their right to lead because of various levels of addiction, whether it's cocaine or it's money, it's gambling, it's violence, it's sexual assault, abuse, domestic violence. I mean, we see people even in pro sports who lose their opportunity to do what they do for a living because of addictions.
So we're going to play a video, and this is of an interview of your wife that kind of talks about the addictions that you guys went through as a couple and how it affected her. So if we can cue that video up.
Well, he actually told me he had a sexual addiction before we were married. At the time I thought, well, that's his problem, not mine, because I didn't know what the repercussions were. Well, he was addicted for 10 years, the first 10 years of our marriage. He's been free for 15 years now. God led me to pray that I would see my husband through God's eyes. Our marriage is more loving and open. We communicate more openly. I don't have to walk around feeling like I'm walking on eggshells anymore. You know, God was revealing how his addiction fed into my low self-esteem and my feelings of, well, I just can't do anything right for him. I can't satisfy him sexually or otherwise. All those feelings of not being enough for him, not being good enough. I would feel shame from him, but it wasn't my shame, it was from him.
So I know that you've, there we go. I know you've seen this video a million times, and our viewing audience could hear everything that she was saying, but we were kind of blocked by that. You want to kind of touch on some of what she had talked about?
You know, the very first conversation my wife and I had about my addiction, I had no clue what kind of impact it had on her. In fact, we were doing a teaching when it really, like a ton of bricks, fell on me. And she had already written her book. I'd already written my book. We'd already done, speaking in other engagements. But we were in Atlanta, Georgia, in a little church, and we'd been asked to come and speak on marriage. And as we were talking about the addiction, somebody said to her a similar question to what was in there. Is there hope, and what saved your marriage? And she answered like she normally does with very short sentences, because my wife doesn't talk a lot. She said, boundaries. And they went, oh, what does that mean? And she just said, I set boundaries. And I had a really hard time with that for a minute. I said, okay, for those of you in the listening audience, this might help a little bit. If you've ever been to the Cheesecake Factory, the Cheesecake Factory has a 35-page menu, and everything on the menu is the best of the best of the best, in my opinion. All the cheesecakes, all the Asian food, all the barbecue, all the Southern home cooking, all the salads, all the pastas, it's all top-notch. And when you're an addict like I was, that's kind of what you want, that smorgasbord of everything. Now, my particular addiction was pornography. And so sexual addiction that I brought into our marriage said, every time I walk in the bedroom and close the door, my mind looks like a Cheesecake Factory in you. I want everything, some of this and some of that, a little of this, and it's hard to push away from the table. And for her, having been a rape victim, having been a single mom when I married her, she had some put off kind of feelings as a result of that. Feelings of inadequacy, feelings like she just couldn't be enough, like she couldn't measure up to everything on that menu. But it was about 10 years into our marriage that she kept praying, God, change him, God, change him, God, change him. And God finally replied and said, I'm not trying to change him. I'm trying to change you. And she said, I learned then to set some really specific boundaries. I learned to say, I'm not going to kick you out of the house or out of the bedroom or tell you, no, we're not going to have any kind of relations that way. But I am going to say, you can have all of this you want. So suddenly, instead of the Cheesecake Factory menu, we had the Cane's chicken menu. And you know what you get at Cane's? Chicken. Maybe some fries, maybe some slaw, but chicken. There's no burgers on the menu. There's no mac and cheese on the menu, no steak, no fish, just chicken. And it took a while to get used to that reality, but a lot of what saved our marriage was the fact that she didn't completely close me off. When she realized that the reason I behaved the way that I did was because of the addiction, she said, okay, I can see what's feeding this, and I can also see the outcropping. But if you'd asked me any time in the first 10 years of our marriage, do you abuse your wife? I would have looked at you like you were nuts. Absolutely not. There's no way I would abuse my wife. I've never hit her. When I raise my voice, it's only because she's hard of hearing sometimes. And I mean that literally, not figuratively. I say something sitting in the car next to her, and she's like, what? And so I speak up a little bit, but I do have a booming voice when I use it. And sometimes people think that's yelling. But I would never be physically or emotionally abusive from my perspective. And so part of what she talks about in that video is how the pride and the selfishness that goes along with every addiction becomes common course for a relationship. And she talks about how surviving through that means coming to that place where you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to let you consequence in your own convictions and your own addiction, but I have to stand my ground. I have to protect myself. I have to realize how much of your demand on me is unrealistic because it's not about me and it's not even about us. It's about you and your addiction. And again, it doesn't matter if that addiction is alcohol or that addiction is a sexuality and pornography like mine was, or it's a meth addict or any other kind of addiction. The addiction drives you. When you're an addict, you have a slave master, and it's not you. You're the slave. And when the slave master says jump, you jump. When he says go off the deep end, you go off the deep end. You do what the addiction tells you to do. And until you gain control of it, that's the case always. That's why people find themselves at risk in their marriage. They find themselves at risk with their kids. They find themselves at risk with the law. They find themselves at risk of losing a career because the addiction owns them and drives them to do things that are absolutely illogical to anybody else.
So, Loren, you've already mentioned a couple of times different types of addictions, whether it's drugs or alcohol or pornography, but you can also have addictions to leadership and power. And people have to be in control, whether it's in a political sense or a business owner, a manager, a boss, a business owner that is dictating or being a dictator to their employees. How did your addictions, how did those things manifest itself in your relationship with Karen and other friends, the rest of your family, in your leadership responsibilities? How was it manifesting itself?
Well, as you said, you can be addicted to power almost to the point of tyranny. In fact, a lot of people who become tyrants, you can look back at the behavior that they exhibit and you see some of the same things. The two cores of any addiction are selfishness and pride, meaning I'm going to get my fix at whatever cost. I don't care what it costs anybody else. And I'm so proud that I'm not going to allow anybody else's argument to stop me. I don't care about your pain. I don't care about your problems. And so when you look at a tyrant in a business place or a tyrant in a political sense or a tyrant in the home, you find somebody who is always demanding something of somebody else. They're always pushing the envelope and what can I get out of this? How do I get my way? How do I get it to work for me? And it becomes extremely manipulative. So you may see a manager and I found myself not as much in the corporate world or in the management world, but especially in the home, getting everything I wanted by manipulation, whether it was guilt or it was the manipulation of somebody else's emotions or making them feel like they should be doing something for me because they pitied me. Whatever it was that I wanted, I would get it. And I used some of the same manipulation, if you will, on my kids and fellow employees and even friends. So,
Loren, you said something about pride, and I think you said arrogance. I had a pastor friend that many years ago said the root of all sin, all of the challenges that we have, come in that 5-letter word, pride.
Yes,
Sometimes
it was the
you
original
would agree
sin.
with that.
It was the original sin. You know, when you go back to the scripture and talks about Satan being cast out of heaven, Jesus later relates that, and he said, "I saw him fall like lightning from heaven." But when you go back to the original statement, the cause of that was when Lucifer, this beautiful angel with a musical ability within himself, said, "I will make myself above the Most High. I will gather all the worship to myself. I will set my throne above the Most High." And so that selfishness and that pride, that I will determination that drives addiction, it drives all kinds of disaster. But yeah, I believe it was the original sin. And when you see it in somebody's life, the really sad part is it creates its own blinders. So most people, and I've been challenged with it, I've fought it all of my life. I've been accused of it. Even when I have to go back to my mentors and go, okay, this is what happened. And somebody said it's because of my pride. Do you agree? And they're like, well, maybe not in this case, but it may be that you're calling out some pride in them. So, watch yourself. But yeah, when the pride is in you and you know it, it takes a lot of restraint. And humility is not an easy thing to accomplish.
Absolutely not. Absolutely
So true.
not. So you have some addicts that say, I'm not hurting anyone. If I'm just sitting here and doing my own drugs, or if I'm just sitting here getting my buzz on, or sitting here watching porn or whatever, I'm not hurting anyone. Do you believe addicts represent a risk or danger to people other than themselves?
Well, like I said, the addiction itself creates its own set of blinders. And one of those blinders, just to use a really simple illustration, an alcoholic who runs out of beer in the middle of the afternoon on Saturday, maybe already has had 4, 5, or 6 of them, straps his toddler into the back seat of the car, drives to the liquor store or the grocery store to buy more beer, and drives back home with the toddler strapped in the back of the car. Now, would a sane, logical, practical, caring parent put their child at risk like that? I mean, if you asked someone, what if your daughter-in-law, son-in-law, brother-in-law, next-door neighbor strapped your kid into their car seat and drove drunk? Or if you got into your car and realized your neighbor was drunk, would you wait for them to pass before you drove? And yet the level of risk that an addict is willing to take and write it off as, I got this under control. That denial is probably the biggest problem with every addiction, to say, I'm not really an addict, I just have a fixation for, or I'm not really an addict, I could stop anytime I want. The biggest denial in the world, everybody makes a joke of it. But the reality is, once that addiction owns you, until you find the way to break that addiction, that behavior is going to manifest itself even when it's illogical. I recently had an encounter with a young man who was addicted to meth, violently attacked senior citizens that he lived with and tried to take possession so that he could go sell them for more meth. Happened to be high when he did it. Now he's in jail. Well, that's going to be a tough journey for him. Those consequences, though, really point to him that, hey, the choice that you made, the selfishness that you exhibited, the pride in you that rose up and said, I will take your stuff, sell your stuff, get myself more high. That's not an assumption that it was done on a friendly basis, right? I didn't ask for your stuff. I'm just going to take it. Well, can you see that as harm to anybody else? The only way that an addict can say definitively, I would never hurt anybody else with my addiction, is to be on an isolated, like an island somewhere where nobody else is around, and have unlimited access to the resources of their addiction. Whether that's porn or alcohol or food or drama or whatever it is, whatever you're addicted to, power. If you have unlimited access to that and you'll never have to get more resources to get it, and there's nobody else around you, then perhaps you can be an addict who has no ripple effect in somebody else's life.
Wow. Well, we are going to have to feed an addiction right now with our next sponsor. And that's Defender's Gateway Coffee. So how many of you are addicted to coffee out there? One of the good things about Defender's Gateway Coffee is that for every purchase that you make through their website, They make donations to help support first responders and military families that are in need. So here's a short commercial or video about Defenders Gateway.
It's finally here, Defenders Gateway Premium Coffee. Order yours today by land, sea, or air. Every day, millions of Americans sacrifice everything to put out our fires, mend our wounds, heal our sick, and protect our loved ones. Now all Americans have been asked to heed the call to give back to the men and women who gave their all. And remember, folks, 60% of all proceeds of Defenders Gateway Coffee go directly to our defenders and their families. Order yours today at defendersgatewaycoffee.com.
So if you do have an addiction to coffee and you're wanting to help first responders and military families, you can go to defendersgatewaycoffee.com and get more information. Place your order, and let's kind of, if you are too much of a coffee addict, I'm sure they've got decaf for you as well. But check out their website. Back to you, Steve.
Oh, yes. I usually stop drinking coffee about noon because of my addiction, and I won't sleep for the next 3 days if I drink coffee after that. So Loren, you shared you shared a little bit about your addiction. Tell us a little bit more about your addiction, how it got started, and how it was rearing its ugly head with you.
When I say got started, I think the most definitive point in my life was at about 9 years old when I was molested by an 11-year-old boy. And, when you say that, a lot of people think, horrendous, atrocious event, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it was more of a Pandora's box. It was emotions and physical responses and sensations that could have never been fathomed by a 9-year-old mind, but also emotions and sensations that cannot be controlled or understood by a 9-year-old mind either. And so kind of the result is everybody that I know, male or female, between say 5 or 6, when memories are beginning to be solid, up to about 3 or 4 years old, most young people don't remember anything that happened prior to that. Between 4 and 5, those memories become solid things that you can call back on and retell the story. By about 9 or 10 years old, there's kind of an ambiguous stage of maturity where you can remember what happened, but the why is totally gone. The prefrontal cortex and the mind doesn't develop. The idea of long-term consequences, it doesn't develop until, especially young men, are around 25 years old. That's why our insurance drops at that age. But that gap between 4 or 5, when life begins to become recallable, and all the way up to 18 or 19 years old, there's a whole lot that happens in life where we find a thing that we like, whether it's cactus juice or it's some kind of drug or vaping or whatever it is that leads us into addiction. For me, it was sexuality. So whatever it took to get that fix, I was up for. I tried everything I could possibly get my hands on legally and continued on that path. My wife knows before we met, I had over 21 different sexual partners. Once we met, she's been the only one physically, but in my mind, there's been a whole lot of recall back to those people. There's been a whole lot of imagery. There's been a whole lot of online chats that should have never taken place, or views of videos that should have never taken place that did, up until about 10 years into our marriage. And that was the day that she pulled me aside. We had gone to Pine Cove family camp out in East Texas, and our pastor just happened to be leading chapel that day. We walked out of the chapel and she said those words that make every man tremble. We need to talk. Well, we need to talk. It's like turn your head and cough. And I went the rest of the day not knowing if I was going to be mad or just throw up. See, in my mind, I knew all of the tragedy that I had caused in her life. In my mind, subconsciously, I knew the pain that I brought to her, and I knew she deserved better. I also knew that as I look at myself, I see fat and unlovable, and I couldn't figure out why in the world she wanted to stay around. This was the first relationship 10 years in that I hadn't sabotaged and utterly destroyed, but I had tried. I had told her over and over, you ought to go, you can do better, you can find a better guy, you can find a better lover, you can find a richer guy, you can find a better looking guy. Why are you here? And so on this day, I expected what she was going to say is, get out, hit the road, I found somebody better. Instead, we got to the end of the day. in the cabin. The kids are off doing their own thing. She takes my hands. We sit down on the bed, and she says to me, when you say to me that you're fat and unlovable, you're asking me to believe a lie. I know everything that you've done, everything that you've told me, and I have forgiven everything. I know that God sent you to be a gift to me, and I love you just the way you are. I need you to see you the way I do. It took me probably another 4 or 5 years to finish processing everything that was in that statement. But what it came down to was she began to see in me what I couldn't see in me. As she prayed for me, one of the things God told her to do was speak to him as if he is the man that you want him to be, not as if he is the man he's behaving as right now. And through her conversation, she projected me into a better me. And those words literally changed my life, saved our marriage, probably saved my life, because I don't think I would have wanted to go on for very long if I lost her at that point and lost my family. There was just too much at risk. And so that moment, her wisdom, her spiritual insight saved me, saved our marriage, saved our life, and began the process of breaking the addiction. And it was only within a couple of years after that that walked away. It's been 18 years now. But the addiction had such a hold on me that there were times I would take risks that made no sense to get the fix. I would do things that were put everything in jeopardy to get the fix. And I think that's true of a lot of addicts. For a lot of addicts, they get turned on to that substance. They get that emotional high. They get that mental high. They get the sense of euphoria, the escape. And while they're there, everything is wonderful. That was the same for me in every form of sexuality. But when you come down off the high, that's when you come face forward with who you really are. That's when you look in the mirror and you hate yourself and despise yourself, because this slavery of the addiction is kicking your butt and you're losing every time. And that self-loathing is the contrast of the pride that causes this cycle, like a wheel creating more momentum. It's the flywheel of the cycle of abuse and the cycle of addiction.
Loren, you've got so many directions I can take this. I can totally relate to you when you say, when you talk about being molested when you were a young boy. I too was molested. Mine was at about 11 years old by an older family member. And that changed my thinking. I've worked with a lot of clients over the years in my coaching practice that when they were 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, how their minds were rewired, so to speak, or wired in the wrong direction. And as a result, what they thought was acceptable behavior, because that's what they experienced, they didn't realize the damage that they were doing to themselves and to other people. But I've heard so many people over the years say, well, pornography, it only affects the person that is participating. But do you see the impact on the women and men that are also involved in that whole industry? How do you see that impacting our society today?
Well, the reality is it is not a victimless crime, number one. In order for someone to view pornography, there has to be a target, meaning a subject, meaning somebody on the other side. There's a book on the shelf behind me by Dr. Steve Gallagher. He calls it Worshiping at the Altar of Sexual Idolatry. It was the first book that I studied. It was a course that I went through at a church when this whole process was going on for me. And in that book, he talks about the cycle of escalation and the funnel of demise. And if you look at that and realize that regardless of where you start at the top, picture a tornado. It's a large circle. The cycle is long. It takes forever. But the closer you get to the bottom, the closer you are to the final destruction, number one. You're also at this place where the revolutions are shorter, but they're faster, meaning the cycle between hate and love of self, between the pride and the self-loathing, is moving so fast they're almost indistinguishable. Now, to say that is to say there always has to be a target, and sometimes that target goes from, the Victoria's Secrets in the mail, for an example, or staring at women at the mall, or going to the gym and putting yourself in the right treadmill so you can watch the women in their yoga class. Those kinds of mild expressions of a sexual addiction are extremely common. And if you believe the idea of toxic masculinity and the male hierarchy, they're to be expected, boys will be boys. The problem is that woman is still the target. Or if you don't swing that way, that man is the target. That person that you're staring at is the target. And at some point, the only thing you can do is mentally undress them. If you can't physically undress them, if you can't sexually interact with them, then all you can do is imagine. Now, I'm going to take you down a really strange rabbit trail, but I'll challenge you to listen to Dr. Caroline Leaf and Dr. Daniel Amen about the idea of quantum physics theory of entanglement when it comes to the mindset of an addict. See, I know for a fact that there are emotions stirred up in me when I recall images that I viewed 30 years ago, when I recall instances of emotion that I experienced in a sexual moment with someone 40 years ago. Now, that seems really, really messed up, but it's just reality. And if you've ever been on that path, then you know that you can conjure those memories back up. And here's what happens in reality. In your body doesn't know if it was a memory or if it's the future or if it's presently happening. If you can imagine it well enough, all of the endorphins and all of the chemicals and all the hormones in your body react exactly the same as they did way back then. It's called self-stimulation. All of it happens all over again. In the quantum physics theory of entanglement, the idea that once two bodies are entangled, they're never unrelated to each other for the rest of history. Now, Jesus said it in scripture, every other sin is outside of a man's body, sexual sin is in his body. It is the one that can destroy you. Of all the things that you could do wrong, to imagine that the target of your lust has no play in it. They're just a wall painting. They're just a decor. Let me take this down a deep rabbit trail for you. There was a study done in the 1920s. I don't remember exactly who did this study. Dr. Caroline Leaf talks about it in several of her videos, and one of her books called Switch on Your Brain. She talks about a study where people took 2 vials of DNA, and one control group took the DNA and they said bad words, hurtful words, hard words, had a bad attitude toward the vial of DNA that they were holding. And the other group said positive words. They prayed for, they were imaginative and encouraging, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the week, they took the 2 vials, the collections of the vials with the positive enforcement and the negative, and they said, what are the results? Well, the ones that they'd been speaking negatively over, the DNA in the vial was actually dying. And in the other one, they were expressing, meaning they were growing, they were reproducing. And so they said, well, that's pretty fascinating. What happens if we reverse them? And so they took the ones that had been spoken negatively over and the ones that had been spoken positively, and they put them in the other hands. And as they started down that journey, they realized we can reverse the process. By speaking positively, we can encourage the ones that are dying, and by speaking negatively to the ones that we're reproducing, we can make that stop. Just in case you're curious, have we seen any of that, like, say, in the media with the fear porn and all the other ideas of tragedy, 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 tragedy? It's not just drama, it's horrific, end of the world kind of emotional set that happens in us. Well, so they took the study one step further. They said, maybe it's just their body temperature or their chemistry that causes the DNA to either reproduce or die. So they put them 20 miles away and they did the same exercise. And the results were identical. The quantum physics theory of entanglement says once that relationship is established between that person and that vial of that DNA, miles doesn't break it. Time doesn't break it. So the people that I encountered in my teens and 20s that I'm still emotionally, spiritually, psychologically attached to, the universe recognizes that we are entangled. And so when I recall those things, to assume that it has no impact on them is foolishness. Now, if you just want to go back to the basic surface of things and ask yourself, so what is the psychological damage done to a 2-year-old who witnesses a gay pride parade where everyone is acting as if they're engaging in sexuality in the middle of the street? Or what happens to the psychology of a 10-year-old girl who's being objectivized, whether she's being physically touched or just viewed, while she knows that it's her sexuality that is creating some kind of stimulus for all these grown men or grown women who are viewing her? If you think that's not damaging, then you're crazy. But then you have to ask the question, what 2-year-old, 10-year-old, or even 20-year-old or 40-year-old female would intentionally submit themselves to the viewing, the stares, the jeers, the comparisons of everybody around them? Well, maybe at a certain age, it's a financial incentive. But in the beginning, almost all of those are victims of sexual assault and sex trafficking. They are the victims of some of the worst, most hideous psychological and physically damaging crimes ever committed against humanity. When Dr. Gallagher talks about that tornado, the swirling, one of the things he talks about is if you don't get off of this path, the pride, the anger, the selfishness will lead you to one of two things. Either you will find yourself locked up for your sexual behavior, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your family, et cetera, because of prostitutes and the like, or you'll find yourself in pedophilia. The holy grail of the satanic version of porn addiction is sex with a child. It doesn't take much study reading Kinsey to realize that the Kinseyan ideas of sexuality, when he stimulated a 4-month-old little boy to the point of completion and then said, see, what that tells me is that children are sexual at birth. No, what it tells me is that you're a sick pedophile and you should have been imprisoned and not called that a study worthy of college degree programs and worthy of sex education in public schools. But the sexualization of our society has been going on since the dawn of time. We can go back to even in the scripture, there were men whose wives became prostitutes at the temple. So this is not a new thing. It's a human destruction thing. And I think to assume that it's not dangerous or harmful is literally to be living with blinders on.
Loren, the sad thing about that story you just illustrated is he probably got a lot of government funding to do it.
Oh, tons. Yeah. Tons and tons. But you may not know this about Kinsey, though. He had a sales marketing rep. When he started his project, he couldn't get anybody on the college campuses to accept his ideologies in the late 60s about schools. So he hired a guy who would go around and hand out pamphlets on the school. His name was Larry Flint.
Oh, jeez.
Wow.
Okay, say no more.
I've got a 2-part question for you. For
Okay.
me, alcohol was my vice. I've been 35 years pretty much clear. I don't touch a drop of alcohol. But, I had a breaking point, and the motivation for me was, as a mentor, as an educator, I did not want to be a hypocrite for my students. I was working with the DARE organization, talking about not doing drugs, not doing alcohol. And if I were to talk about all this, hey kids, don't do drugs, but then they were to see me in a public setting drunk off my butt, then I would be a hypocrite. And for me,
Right.
That was my motivation to quit, or my breaking point, is I wanted to be a better symbol, a better mentor, a better person in front of the people that I coach or that I train. What was yours as far as breaking point, and how did you find a motivation to quit? And then to piggyback on that, because I know you both are very faithful people, what would you say to our viewing audience, people that have addictions that are not churchgoers or don't have faith? How can they get that kind of help to find the motivation to quit?
So the breaking point for me was a moment of awareness, for lack of a better term, from the coaching world. I became acutely aware of the fact that I wasn't living in an isolated bubble. It's easy when you're driving in a car with tinted windows. In fact, I think it was the movie Transformer, when he's driving in his Maybach and cruising down the highway, and he's throwing all kinds of hand gestures at the car next to him. And the guy in the car with him was like, stop doing that. They're going to shoot at us. And he's like, they can't even see us. There's no way they can see us. These windows are tinted too dark. Now, I think a lot of us that live with addiction feel like we're living in a limo with tinted windows. We can go about our business doing whatever we want to. Nobody's really paying any attention. I mean, it's just us. It's just one of us in the world. Why would anybody care? But when you realize that there's an immediate observation, especially of your children, that kind of changes things. So I can back up 18, almost 20 years. And my oldest son, now 25, recently married, his thing used to be he wanted to be wherever dad was. I have a puppy like that now, but it doesn't matter where I'm at or what I'm doing. He would be there. In fact, we lived in a very small house at the time, and he would come in, and the bathroom was so small that if I was on the commode, he would come in, and you had to step into the bathtub to close the door. There wasn't enough room to get around that. And he would still come in and bring his pillow and his teddy bear and curl up at my feet at 5 a.m. while I was getting ready for work. And that particular morning, I was in the shower and doing what addicts do, and he was laying in the foot of the shower asleep. And as I was doing what I do, he wakes up and he looks at me and he says, "Can we be done now?" Now, I wasn't doing anything to him. In my mind, I was in the tinted windows world. He was nowhere around. There was nothing going on. Nobody was observing. Nobody knew what I was doing. I had my back to him. I wasn't paying any attention to his presence. Until I was. And his little voice reminded me what was going on. And in that moment, it was like I heard the voice inside my head say, if somebody else were caught by you doing what you're doing right now, what would you do to them? And I said, I would rip their arms off, physically detach their arms from their body and beat them to death with them for exposing my child to this. And that was an aha moment, like a kick to the gut. It just puts you back on your backside to go, just like you said, the awareness of what if someone caught me doing what I've so long thought nobody knew about. And yet the emotional turmoil that it creates for a spouse, that it creates for the children. And forget about the pride and the anger and the arrogance. What about her own judgment of herself, thinking, well, why does he have to do that if I'm here? If I climb out of the shower, am I not enough? Am I not pretty enough? Am I not sexy enough? Am I not willing enough? What makes him have to go somewhere else for that? And so when all those things started swirling together in my mind, there was a breaking point that the self-loathing went beyond, I hate that I can't break this habit, to I hate the guy who's doing that. And eventually there's going to have to be a separation between me and the guy who's doing that. And in the spiritual world, we'd call that death to self. I think the same level of awareness has to come whether you're a person of faith or not. I will tell you, though, from a scriptural standpoint, and this is hard to hear, but it's a truth. From a scriptural standpoint, it says when you cast out one of these demons and you don't put anything in their place, then 7 demons worse than him will come back and take up abode in that place. So you see it a lot. People who quit smoking gain a lot of weight. People who stop alcohol find another drug. Maybe it's attention, maybe it's football, maybe it's gambling, whatever it is. But they find a way to replace that habit of addiction because the mind allows you to say, I need something to fill this space, and then behavior follows that. Now, the 10-week course that I do on this really talks about one other aspect that outside of the spiritual world is hard to comprehend, but you know that you've seen the ill effects of it. To quote Dr. Caroline Leaf again, she says 75 to 98% of all of the major illnesses in the human life, all across the world, come from one thing, and that's toxic thinking. And when she describes toxic thinking and how it creates inflammation, and which then goes on to all kinds of cancers and diabetes and weight gain and joint problems and heart attack, the stress levels and anxiety hormones like cortisol that destroy the body from inside, they're all related to toxic thinking. But the one thing that breaks toxic thinking is to change the way that you think. And the first part of that is forgiveness. Now, if you've ever known somebody who holds a grudge, who says, well, you did this to me 25 years ago, 35 years ago, and I will never forget that. Well, that person is living with that toxicity in their head. And that toxicity, this is neurochemical, neurobiological. We're not talking about spirit. We're not talking about faith. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about what your body does to you. If you think I'm kidding, read somebody like Jack Canfield. He talks in his book, Success Principles, about a guy who is in a train car on Thanksgiving. He's cleaning out the car. Everybody else goes home, skeleton crew, they leave at the middle of the day for Thanksgiving Eve. They all go home. Well, the wind blows, the door shut, and he gets locked inside this reefer car that they've been using to transport frozen turkeys in. He's just cleaning it out. But when the wind closes the door and he can't get out, nobody notices until the day after Thanksgiving. Well, his wife is called and she's crying, and they send out a search party, and they finally come and find him inside this train car. all of his fingertips frostbitten, asphyxiation, and like he'd been frozen to death like a turkey inside this train car. The irony was this: the roof vent was open, big enough he could have crawled out of it. The ambient temperature inside that car, 74 degrees the whole time. There was no way that the car froze him to death. His mind did. And so the people who get caught up in addictions and don't find their way out, whether it's through a spiritual belief system or not, if they don't change the way they think about their priorities and about the thoughts that enter their mind, if they can't find a way of escaping that call of the addiction, then they will find themselves victims to it. And forgiveness, the ability to let go, is hard when somebody has hurt you, when somebody has led you down that path. Here's the one that's harder, though. To look in the mirror and realize after you've lost a marriage, after you've lost a career, after you've lost your home, after you've lost everything that matters to you, to look in the mirror and go, you did this, you're that man. See, that was the reply when I said I would rip his arms off and beat him to death with it. That same voice inside my head said, you are that man. You are the one exposing your family to this. You are the one taking that risk. You are the one pushing the envelope. And that was enough for me to say, okay, I'm done. Now, I'm not going to say there's no hope for people to quit. There are all kinds of 12-step programs, all kinds of medications to allay the effects and the desire for certain kinds of addictions. But I can tell you that if you try to do it on your own without accountability, without a support group, without the spiritual support of understanding something greater than yourself and some greater cause than just your own peace, chances are you're going to be fighting something else in its place, or you're going to fight and lose and start over again. How many people tell you, well, I used to be addicted to cigarettes, but I quit 22 times and started 23? Well, the truth is they're still addicted. And that really is a challenge for a lot of people. You think you beat the addiction, but it's really still beating you. And that's a challenge.
Oh, that is so true.
Well said.
We could easily spend the next 4 or 5 hours talking about this entire mindset. All the information from Caroline Leaf. Love her work. Very fascinating. But we've got some more bills that we have to pay. And I'd like to share with you just briefly some information about LifeWave and tell you a couple of real quick stories. My friend Janet was stationed in Kuwait back during the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein started blowing up all of the oil refineries. All of the toxic fumes started blowing towards Kuwait. As a result, she developed an autoimmune issue that lasted for nearly 20 years. She was in constant pain. I introduced Janet to this little patch, and it's called an X39 patch. And what it did for her was it stimulated her stem cells and told her stem cells to go back to work. Within less than a week, she was virtually pain-free. A little over a year ago, I had an accident and I broke my leg and actually had to have 3 different surgeries. The first surgery, I was on pain medication for about 10 days after the surgery. The second surgery I had back in September, my friend Barbara introduced me to these X39 patches, and I was only on pain medication for 3 days. When I had the third surgery in December, the same thing, only 3 days on the pain medications. Between you and me, I do not like taking drugs at all, especially opioids. And so if you're dealing with chronic pain of any sort, whether it's shoulder pain, back pain, neck pain, ankles, knees, whatever the case is, if you're looking to get more energy, better focus, better sleep at night, there are so many benefits that you can get from the X-Wave, from the X39 patch from LifeWave. If you're having any of those chronic pains and you'd like to be rid of those pains, reach out to me. I will give you a sample of the patches, and also we'll give you a 90-day money-back guarantee. So reach out today. Let's see if we can help resolve some of the problems that you're having with your chronic pain and lack of focus and better sleep. So Loren, back to you. You have written several different books. Why don't you share briefly with us some of the highlights on some of the books? We're starting to run a little bit low on time.
Well, Live a More Excellent Life was the first book that I completed, and really, it may eventually be renamed Story Power, because the collection of stories in the book really points to the lessons that I learned in life growing up the only son of a single mom. You know, how do you deal with those people in your life that are always creating a disaster or creating drama? How do you deal with the people that come into your life and steal your dreams or tell you those are useless? You're never going to be anything. How do you create a vision for your life? That's what that book is all about. It really is targeted for people who are starting out or starting over. So high school graduates, recently separated veterans, people who are walking into life the way that it is now for the first time, maybe coming out of prison, maybe coming out of a lifelong marriage, or whatever major transitions are taking place. If you've never had a life coach, if you've never had a mentor, if you've never been through that kind of training, this book is a really good starting point. And it also comes with a mentorship training package, so that if somebody says, hey, I love the material in here, I've never written content like that myself, but I would love to help all my friends who are in the same journey, there's actually a way to purchase the material for yourself in such a way that you can actually teach it, creating your own masterminds and small groups and all that kind of stuff. The second book is the one that we're talking about today. That's the 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. That book is the story of the journey of my walking out of addiction. And like I said, it was a moment of awareness and then a process. And that process was really simple. Identify the problem, confess, repent, forgive, and forget. And if you don't learn that forgetting is not, I can't remember, it is, I choose not to recall, then you will find yourself in that cycle where the hormones in your body get out of balance and they're like, I got to go back to the addiction. Whatever the addiction is, the process in this book will change your life, because it walks you through how to take those thoughts that are beating the daylights out of you and beat them into submission instead. It's a very powerful book. Now, the next 3 that I'm working on, I have been at the 85 to 90% completion stage for a couple of years now. I feel like every time I go to try to wrap them up, like God says, I've got more to add to that. You get a little more to learn in that area, but that's Learn to Roar Leadership and Learn to More Communication, which are side by side. They're the exact same process, but one applies to leadership and one to communication skills. And then the other one may be my magnum opus, although I'm way too young to be declaring that. It is the book that kind of sets everything into a giant profile, and that's called The Attitude Hack. I've trained that process for the National PTA, State of Texas PTA, the Georgia PTA Leadership Conference, the University of Kinshasa's graduate program psychology degree, all of their graduates, for the Parliament of the Congo, and at several other places, including just local school districts. So I think the Attitude Hack is a process that teaches leaders how to deal with people who are exhibiting an attitude, how you can identify the attitude and then convert it to another attitude, what those principles look like, and how to get that done.
As a John Maxwell leadership speaker, what are some other topics you cover, and how can our viewers get a hold of you to maybe set up, have you come in as a guest speaker?
Yeah, if you go to jlorennorris.com /contact, there's actually a form right there on that page where you can fill in, this is the kind of thing that I'm looking for. It lists all the speaking topics, all of the ones that I just mentioned, as well as the Story Power Masterclass, which is kind of my pinnacle, if you will, at this point in my life. It also lists the ones that I'm licensed under the John Maxwell program to teach. And so you can select those. And almost everything that I teach can be done in a free lunch and learn. So if you want to experience the free lunch and learn, you can go right there on the website, jlorennorris.com, and under About Resources, there's actually a tab for free lunch and learn. We can schedule that. I'll actually come to your office. You pay for lunch. I'll provide the training, and I will train anybody on your team. Usually there's some qualifications to it, but you can apply for it. It's usually 5 to 10 employees kind of a thing, but I'm glad to come out and take any of those curriculums and provide a lunch and learn opportunity to really challenge your people. And then all of those obviously can be done in breakout sessions or ongoing mastermind groups as well.
Loren, as you know, we have very similar paths that we have taken. You going the John Maxwell route, me going the Zig Ziglar route. mindset is exactly the same. There's no difference. You got your materials, I've got my own materials, etc. I can totally relate when you talk about having those 3 books that are 80% completed. I've only got one that's 80% completed along with my other 3 books, but I can totally, completely relate. I just want to say thank you for sharing with us today. You've given us so much to think about, so many things to consider about addiction, about pride, so many different resources that we can go back to. So I personally want to say thank you for you coming and sharing. You've got so much to offer, and we look forward to having you back again. Ray?
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for coming on to our show. Those of you that are Taboo talkers out there and you would like to give us some questions or feedback, please go to our Facebook page. Also our YouTube page, which we always say like, subscribe, comment, and share. If you want to be an advertiser on our show, get a hold of Steve or I through Taboo Talk with Ray and Steve. We don't have the website yet, but go to our Facebook page and we'd be happy to talk to you about how that process works for being an advertiser. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure. Great interview today. I look forward to our next week's interview. This is Ray and Steve with Taboo Talk. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.